Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third in the series of episodes on my work in Afghanistan from 2003 through 2007. We're going to unpack today some of the different regions of Afghanistan and some of my experiences there, and also some of my overall observations of the work that we did while I was in Afghanistan. Hope you'll enjoy it. I want to remind you that my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, is available on Amazon, and there's a whole section on Afghanistan in this book that I think you'll find quite interesting, that talks about a lot of things that are different from what we're talking about on the podcast. So I'd encourage you to grab a copy of this on Amazon and read it and give me a rating, make a comment, whatever you'd like to do, because that will make me better and it'll help others know whether or not this is the kind of book for them as well. So let's jump into the session today. When you look at Afghanistan, and most countries are this way in some way, shape, or form, although I think Afghanistan is really a prime example of this. It can't be looked at as one monolithic entity. Afghanistan is a very diverse and rich culture made up of different ethnicities, different worldviews. The only thing it really has in common around the country is Islam. But even that is not as cut and dried as it might sound. So I want to talk to you about some of the country's provinces today that I had the chance to visit while I was there, and some of my experiences within them. And of course, we have to start with Kabul, because that's where I lived, even though I traveled extensively throughout the country. I lived in Afghanistan's capital of Kabul, first in an area of town called Wazir Akbar Khan, which is where a lot of the expatriates lived at that time. We had a compound there for probably the first 8 or 9 months that I was in the country. And then we found a larger compound. As our projects grew, we needed more space, and we found a larger compound in an area of the city called Sharina, or New City. And this compound was quite large. It was right across the street from the Dutch embassy in a very accessible area of Kabul. I have so many memories and sights and smells and locations that I want to talk about in Kabul, but I'm just going to pick a few things. First of all, early on, any expat, especially an American, living in Kabul would become well familiar with Camp Eggers. Camp Eggers is closed now. It was closed during the partial drawdown of U.S. forces in 2015, but when I was there, it was quite large, and it was the headquarters for Combined Forces Command of Afghanistan. It was situated near the U.S. Embassy and near the Presidential Palace, and was a very big part of that whole area of the city. It was named for Captain Daniel Eggers, who was killed by an IED explosion in 2004, and was a very prominent part of the United States military's presence in Kabul. Outside of that, there are many other locations I want to touch on very quickly. First of all, Chicken Street and Flower Street. Now, you're going to think this is funny, but on Chicken Street, there were no chickens. There used to be chickens, but there weren't chickens when I was there. In this area of the world, they tend to name streets after what is sold on that street. Formerly, chickens were sold on Chicken Street. But by the time I got there, Chicken Street was really a whole line of souvenir shops selling everything that you can imagine that would remind you of Afghanistan, from furniture to carpets to antiques to trinkets, whatever they felt like expatriates wanted to buy, it was available on Chicken Street. My first trip to that area of the city was quite entertaining because there were always young boys running around. You never knew really why they were there or where they came from, but they were always there. And they would always run up to you in their halting English and say, I want money. I'll be your bodyguard. I'll walk around with you. I'll keep you safe. Well, of course, they couldn't keep anybody safe. And of course, they were about as far from a bodyguard as I am from Mr. T. But usually for a few trinkets, they could at least keep the other thundering hordes away from you, keep the other boys away from you who were trying to earn a little bit of money by walking around with the foreigners. And it was a good way for them to practice their English. So many times I would find one, I would give him a little bit of money and just say, either watch the car so that nobody bothers it, or keep these others away from us and you can walk around with us. It was quite funny, but it was always chaotic down there. There were always expats, there were always locals, all mingled together. Typically the U.S. military at that time was patrolling down there as well. There were times when it was off limits, when we went white city, so to speak. White city was the term they used for being locked down in your compound. So there were times when you couldn't go to Chicken Street. But Kabul became a very restrictive place if you had to be stuck in your compound all the time. So there came a point when you were desperate to get out, and Chicken Street was as good a place to go as any, because not only could you buy some trinkets there, but there were also really good kebab or naan bread stands nearby where you could grab something inexpensive to eat as well. Now, Flower Street, on the other hand, was very much what it sounds like. They sold a lot of flowers on Flower Street. And I have a funny story about flowers, as a matter of fact, because Debbie came to visit while I was in Afghanistan for 3 weeks. And prior to her coming in, a couple of days before, I had asked our program manager, Besmela, to remind me that I needed to get flowers for her. And so the day that she was coming in the afternoon and that morning, he reminded me. And I said, oh, yes. But I looked in my billfold. I didn't have any of the local currency called Afghanis, or AVs, we called them. I didn't have any. So I just pulled out $20 US and handed it to him and said, please have one of the drivers go out and get some flowers, and we will settle up on the change later on. So he did that. One of our drivers and myself went to the airport to pick up Debbie. By the time we got back to the compound, we pulled in. I introduced her to everyone. I asked Bismillah, did they get the flowers? He said, yes, they're over at the house. Our compound was all surrounded by a very high wall, but it was in two parts. One part was our office, and then there was a wall there with a door cut into it, and you could walk through that door and then be on the other side of the compound where it was our house. So I took Debbie over to get her settled on the other side of the compound where our house was, and walked in the living room, and there were flowers everywhere. It looked like a florist shop exploded in this room. There were flowers on the table, on the chairs, everywhere. And so Debbie is laughing so hard she can't contain herself. I go back and get Besmela. I said, Besmela, what's the deal? He said, well, you gave $20 US and he bought that many flowers. I said, no. I meant for him to buy a bouquet of flowers and then provide the change. Basmala was, oh, I see. Too late. We now had a florist shop in the living room of our house. Very, very funny story. But things like that happened a lot. Things got lost in translation. But nobody tried harder to please than the Afghans as a whole or our Afghan team. There were many funny instances like that. When I first moved into that compound, we were buying furniture and getting everything sorted, and wintertime was coming, and I needed a cover for my bed. And so again, I went to Basmala and I said, Basmala, please talk to the drivers and provide them some money and have them go out and get me a heavy bed cover, like a blanket or what you would call a quilt. And he said, for sure. And I said, but I don't want anything that is ridiculous looking. I don't want anything that's wild looking. I just want a basic, very tasteful cover for the bed. No problem. So I give him the money, this time in AVs, and they go out, buy the bed cover, buy the quilt. I'm in meetings all day. I come back to the compound that evening, walk over to the house side, go into my room, and here is the bed adorned with a red kind of sparkly bed cover with a heart in the middle of it. I just shook my head. I wasn't even upset. It was something that was very common. To them, that was something that was very normal. And it wasn't that they wanted to do something I didn't want. They thought they were doing exactly what I wanted by getting something that wasn't garish. To them, that wasn't at all. And so I just kept it. It was a reminder to me of how giving and thoughtful the Afghan people were, and certainly our staff was. I could relay dozens of stories like that are quite funny, but also show how great the people are there and how much they tried so hard to do a good job. There were other very iconic sites in Kabul that I frequented. Out near the Ministry of Commerce in West Kabul was Darul Aman Palace, which was the old palace of the kings, and it was blown up while I was there. It was in a very big state of disrepair after a lot of war, and part of the Taliban forces had used it as a base during the most recent fighting in 2001, and it had been heavily damaged. But I used to take visitors out there and show them that palace, even in its very dilapidated state, as a reminder of what Afghanistan was at one point in time. A monarchy where a king was trying to modernize and systematize the country, but it all came undone in a very short amount of time, or certainly a relatively short amount of time. Other sites, the Gardens of Babur, they were just being reconstructed when I was there, but still they were very beautiful. And the main thing about the Gardens of Babur was, even though they were somewhat still dilapidated while I was there because of years of neglect and no money to keep them up, etc., it was a quiet place in the city where you could walk and you could think. The rest of Kabul was absolute chaos. People going everywhere, doing everything. But in those gardens, you could walk and you could reflect and quietly on your day. And there were mountains all around. The views were very nice. I took Debbie there, and I think that she quite liked the gardens of Babur. I hear that they've had a lot of money spent on them in recent times, and I'm sure I've not been back, but I'm sure that they are quite beautiful now. One of the most iconic, but at the same time sad places in the city while I was there was the Kabul Zoo. This zoo had been really on the front lines of a lot of the fighting in multiple wars with the Russians, with the Mujahids during the Civil War, then with the invasion in 2001, and it was a decrepit place. The Afghans liked it because that was the closest thing that they had to a zoo, and they could see the animals, etc. But one of the most famous residents of that zoo was a one-eyed lion named Marjan. And Marjan had one eye because someone had thrown a grenade at some point during one of the battles and had wounded Marjan severely, and so he only had one eye. And he was in his very latter years when I was there. He's long since deceased now. But the story goes, and whether or not there's an urban legend, I don't know, but it was told to me as the truth. But the story was that during the fighting, a Taliban fighter had jumped into Marjan's cage, Marjan's enclosure, not seeing him, to try to ambush coalition forces. And Marjan, being very hungry because there was nothing to eat, and the zookeepers had all either fled or were trying to find as much food for the animals as they could and still keep themselves alive. The story goes that the lion attacked him and ate him. Whether or not that's the truth stands to be debated, but it was told to me by someone who purportedly was in the know. But seeing old Marjan the way I did in his deplorable state, I would 100% believe that that could have happened. Another iconic place in Kabul that would really make your blood run cold was National Stadium. So National Stadium was the football stadium. A lot of the rallies and events were also held in this outdoor stadium in Kabul. Right outside of the stadium, they had several aircraft and pieces of military equipment from prior wars on display. But the stadium, they also did buzkashi, which is the national sport of Afghanistan, in the stadium on occasion. But the backstory of this stadium and its reputation was really built during the Taliban time, when that was a place of execution. And there were, as many of my friends there said, this place had bad juju. A lot of bad things happened there. The first time that I went there, I was with an Afghan colleague who talked about something called the Dance of the Dead, which is when they were executing or beheading prisoners, or what they considered, the Taliban considered to be outlaws there. And you might be beheaded for anything. For looking at a woman when you shouldn't have, for being caught drinking, for wearing your beard too long, whatever the flavor of the day was, you might end up in Kabul Stadium with people sitting around waiting for you to be executed. And he told me that during beheadings they would lop off the head, and then they would pour hot oil on the neck, and the body would flop like a chicken. And they called it the Dance of the Dead. A disgusting act, a deplorable time. And that stadium was, regardless of what events are ever held in there now, that'll always be tied to that type of deplorable event. I have so many remembrances of Kabul. It's such a taciturn city in some ways, but such a fascinating one in others. In Kabul at that time, and again, I haven't been there for several years now, so this may not be the case anymore, but when I was there, they did not have a functioning sewer system. They had trenches that ran on the sides of the streets where sewage would run. And one day during a rainstorm, it didn't rain in Kabul a great deal, but one day during a rainstorm, I had a meeting, and I was jumping out of the passenger side of our vehicle, not thinking. I was on the telephone at the time, and jumped right into the sewer. So Noor, our driver, helped me out as much as we could, got me dried off, and I went ahead and did my meeting and went back to the compound and changed. And of course, my friends found out about this and they thought it was quite funny. Even our Afghan staff had to muffle their laughter when they heard what I had done because of my own inattentiveness. But a few weeks later, we were going out to dinner with some expat colleagues, and one of them was my friend Fran. And we were in our vehicles. We were headed down to the restaurant. It's dark. Once again, I jump out right into the sewer. So we jumped back in, went back to the compound, pulled in the gate, and my colleague Christina, who was still at the compound, walked outside and said, "I thought you all were going to dinner." And Fran said, "Well, Mark fell in the sewer." And Christina said, "Again?" And Fran said, "What do you mean? He fell in before?" Yeah, he fell in. And so I guess I was a little bit of a slow learner, but I was not a fan of the sewer system in Kabul, and it was not a fan of mine, evidently. And so I ended up having a few run-ins with the sewer system that I didn't want to have. Another very funny thing that occurred in Kabul is my deputy chief of party at the time, a guy named Tim Bisbee, former military, really, really good guy. Fearless, would go out and do the work, and at a high standard, and all of us really respected him a lot. But he had been on a trip to the northern part of the country, and he came back from that trip with an AK-47. I said, "What's the deal with the AK-47? He said, "Oh, I bought this from a guy for $100. And I thought it was cool to have one, and can I keep it?" And I said, "Look, as long as it's unloaded, that's fine. Just put it over in the corner of the office there. It'll be something interesting for people to talk about." And so he leaned it over against the wall. And we basically just forgot about it. We would show it to people every now and then. They'd say, "Oh, it's an AK. Yeah, it's cool." But we basically forgot about it. Well, several months later, Tim departed Afghanistan. And of course, he couldn't take the AK with him, so it stayed. Well, since it was unloaded, I just left it there. And one day, a new guy came to our compound that I'd been introduced to, a new expatriate. And we always tried to get people oriented when they got to country, and I'd been there a long time. And so this gentleman, his name was Mike, ended up at our compound. I invited him over for a meal, and he walked in and said, "Whoa, is that an AK-47? I said, "Yeah, it is." He said, "I've never seen one up this close. They say it's the easiest gun in the world to use, right?" And I said, "Oh, it is." And I picked up the AK, and I said, "All you have to do is pull back this slide and pull the trigger." And I pulled the trigger, thinking that it was unloaded. It was not, and I blew the windows out of my office. We had guards running everywhere. They thought we were under attack. The whole thing turned into a scene. Mike is on the floor rolling around. The windows are gone. I'm holding this AK. Our guards run in. I handed it to Muhammad, our head guard. I said, "Take this thing away now." I was not very happy with Tim for not doing what I asked him to do and unloading that, but I should have checked it. So that's my bad. And it could have turned out to be a terrible situation. Fortunately, it only turned out to be embarrassing because of my incompetence in not checking this to see if this AK was actually unloaded when I was told that it was. But I'm sure that Mike, wherever he is today, he's still telling that story. A few months before I left Afghanistan, this would have been in early 2007, through a series of events around the city, riots broke out. And our area of the city, Shari Na, was really the center for a lot of these riots, and there were compounds burning around ours. Well, we had pulled all of our staff back to the house side where our safe room was, and Tim and I were up on the wall actually, looking to see what was going on, and we could see the crowds coming down the street, and a compound very close to us was already on fire. And our guards, some of the guards, in fact, most of the guards on the street simply ran away, but our guards came inside the compound. And I remember hearing them standing on the office side where we could look down from the wall of our house onto the office side of the compound and out into the street. And I remember hearing them shouting in Pashtun, and I asked our interpreter, what are they saying? And our interpreter said, they're telling the people that are trying to climb the wall that the first person over dies. And the rioters dropped down off of our wall and they went on about their way. We were evacuated a little bit later by the guards at the United Nations compound and taken to the UN compound and then on to the U.S. Embassy compound, where we spent the night and came back the following day. Even though we did not want to be evacuated, we wanted to stay with our team, but they insisted on it. And so we spent one night at the U.S. Embassy compound. But our compound was saved because our guards respected us enough to stay and do their jobs. And I've always appreciated them for that. We also gained a cat while I was in Kabul. This was a gift, if you want to call it that, from our first DCOP there. His name was Richard. And Rich, for whatever reason, loved this cat. And it was just a pretty horrifying animal, actually. It was somewhat of a feral cat. And this cat was not nice in any way, shape, or form. But he was very smart. So he would maul anyone that came close to him, even me. And he could figure out how to open the doors of your room at night. And so there was no telling what this cat was going to do. If you had conjured up a way to adopt an animal that was absolutely a menace, it would have been this cat. I mean, literally the cat from Pet Sematary. But on the day that we thought our compound got hit by a rocket, which it didn't, our water heater exploded. The first thing I did was run out of my office, grab the cat, grab my laptop, and go over to the safe room. So even as much as I hated that cat, my instinct was to save it when things got difficult. The last remembrance of Kabul I want to share is about my second deputy chief of party there, Tim Bisbee. I already talked about him. Tim was a great guy. I have nothing but good memories of Tim and how hard he worked and how much he tried. But Tim was kind of a case in point as to what could happen in Afghanistan and how people dealt with the pressure when they were there. You know, the way I dealt with the solitude and the pressure and the danger and the loneliness was I worked all the time. And Tim worked hard as well, but he also had serious bouts of depression that really challenged him. And it facilitated the need for him to leave Afghanistan early. I didn't want to see him go, but in Afghanistan, in the kabubble, as we called it, if you adopted the mindset where vices took over, then you had to go. If you stayed there, it was not only a danger to you, it was a danger to everyone around you. And so Tim ended up having to leave early. And but I don't think Afghanistan in a way ever left him. He left Afghanistan, but it didn't leave him. And it caused a lot of different challenges that led to a very unfortunate end of his life. And I want to know if I want to say if Jerry or his sons, Brian or DJ, are watching this, I loved your dad. I loved him so much. He was a great friend. He was a great supporter. And if there was anything that I could do to go back and change anything that happened, I would do that. But I really want to dedicate these 3 Afghanistan episodes to Tim Bisbee, because Tim was our kind of person, and he represented the United States in an outstanding way. It's just that Afghanistan, and he had other hardship assignments as well after he left there, it all starts to crush you if you aren't able to deal with the stress in a reasonable way. Let me tell you about some of the other experiences I had in provinces around Kabul. Parwan province. That is, its claim to fame was that's where Bagram Air Force Base was located. Bagram was the largest U.S. base in Afghanistan, but we didn't build it. It was built by the Soviets in the 1950s. We expanded it, added a second runway, but we did not build Bagram Air Force Base. The interesting thing about Bagram, it became a city really on its own while I was there. It was a huge base. And very nearby, Bagram was a smaller base that was a home of the Special Forces. It was ground zero for the American presence in Afghanistan. Interestingly enough, it was evacuated in secret on July the 1st, 2021 by U.S. forces. They left in the middle of the night. They cut the electricity and they left. And they didn't even tell the Afghan forces that they left. But the Afghans quickly realized the Americans were gone, and so they immediately went into the base and started looting everything possible. And the Afghan forces had to come in and run the looters away and then take control of the base. But they didn't control it for very long, because on August 13th, 2021, Bagram Air Force Base fell to the Taliban. This whole fiasco with Bagram was a case in point. It was indicative of what went wrong in Afghanistan. We spent so much money and so much time training the Afghan forces, the police, the army, and even those of us who were not military and who had nothing to do with that training. We're just looking at it from the outside. We knew this is not going to work. And every military member of the military, U.S. or otherwise, that I talked to while I was in Afghanistan, when they were honest, would say, this is never going to work. They're never going to fight. We leave here, it's going to break down very, very fast. It had before, and certainly in 2021, When the United States and the coalition partners left very quickly, the Afghan army and police crumbled as quickly. And so it wasn't surprising on August 13th, 2021, when Bagram Air Force Base was overrun by the Taliban, and all the millions and millions of dollars we spent on infrastructure, everything that that base had meant to the coalition effort, was all gone in a heartbeat. And it became the manifesto for the Taliban in saying we've defeated the Americans because we're standing here on Bagram Air Force Base and they ran away. Well, of course we didn't run away. We were pulled out by the United States government rather surreptitiously, and because there was no plan, and because our strategy of training the Afghan army and police to bring stability and systemization to the country didn't work, Bagram became the example of a lot of things that went wrong, pardon me, in Afghanistan. Another province, Balkh. Its major city is Mazar-i-Sharif. I went to Mazar-i-Sharif many times. To get there from Kabul, it was quite a long drive, but it's a very beautiful drive through orchards and through mountain passes. And you went through a tunnel there called at the Salong Pass. And this tunnel was old and decrepit. It had been built by the Soviets, but it was an amazing thing to go through. And when you came out the other side, just the vistas that you saw in the mountains are amazing. In some stops along the way, the photo that is at the front of the Afghanistan section is one that was taken of me standing on the road on the way to Mazar-i-Sharif. So this area, Balkh, was ruled, if you will, by a warlord named Abdul Rashid Dostum. I already talked about Dostum in past episodes. We did a lot of work up there, and his forces up there, those that were loyal to him, allowed us to do that work, and so it was a relatively safe area of the country at that time because we had a reason to be there, and they made sure that we were taken care of. But it's quite an interesting city, Mazar-i-Sharif. One of the most iconic structures there is the mausoleum of Imam Ali, who is the first Imam of Shia Muslims. It's supposedly his burial place by tradition, but it's a very beautiful mosque. And there's a photo of Noor and I sitting in front of it on one trip, another trip with white doves flying all around me outside of that mosque. It remains to this day a beautiful and iconic structure of a blue color that you don't see very often, that is mesmerizing when you see it. They also have what's called the Green Mosque there in Mazar-i-Sharif, which is very beautiful on its own. They have a stadium where they play their national sport, Buzkashi, which I talked about in an earlier episode. But some of the funny things that on our trips to Mazar-i-Sharif, on one trip, it was in the late summer, early fall, I really can't remember, and we're driving along, and there's a man by the side of the road selling pomegranates. Well, if there's two things that Afghans loved, or especially our Afghan guards loved more than anything else, they loved ice cream and they loved pomegranates. And so they pull over surreptitiously by the side of the road. Our guards jump out. Our head guard says to me, "Mr. Mark, you stay here. We get pomegranates." So they ran across the road to buy pomegranates. I'm alone in this vehicle. They're over buying pomegranates. I had a theory that the bad guys were probably out there, but they saw me all alone and said, "Too easy. It's too soft to target. And he must not be worth anything if they're willing to leave him by the side of the road." So they probably just left me alone. But in all seriousness, at one point in time, my head guard looks back. He's got his arm full of pomegranates. He looks back at me and goes, And of course, I gave him the thumbs up back, and then they bought their pomegranates, and we went on. I think that was the same trip, although they start to run together after a time. When I ended up getting my picture taken with General Abdul Rashid Dostum of 12 Strong fame, if you've seen the movie, sitting on a couch in Mazar Sharif. And it is a picture that is, I still find quite interesting, that I have displayed in my office. But it's also a little bit terrifying to be sitting next to someone that had the reputation that General Dostum had. But of course, you had to play nice with the warlords when you were in their territory because it was theirs. Forget about the Afghan army or the national government. If something happened up there, they would either take care of you or they wouldn't take care of you. And by they, I mean the local warlord militia. The national army couldn't do anything for you. It was that militia that was important, so you had to play nice with those warlords. Another province that's quite interesting is Uruzgan province down in the south of Kabul. Its major town was called Tarankot. The first chapter in this book is about one of my trips to Tarankot and the warlord that ruled that area called John Muhammad Khan. I won't tell the story here because you can read it in the book, but it is one that you won't want to miss. There's a beautiful area of the country, though. Bandi Timor, the lakes there, Kaz Uruzgan, beautiful, beautiful scenery in that area. Farmland that folds into mountains, and just an amazing place. The first time I went there, I landed in a provincial reconstruction team, PRT, plane on a dirt runway out in the middle of the desert where they corkscrewed us in. So if we took ground fire, there would be a better chance for them to miss us. We were setting on Kevlar vests because if you take ground fire from below, then you don't want to get shot in the rear end. So, pardon me. So we sat on our Kevlar vests. But that was my introduction to Uruzgan province and to Tarankot. And we traveled with the U.S. military while we were there. And on that first trip that I made there to visit John Muhammad Khan's compound for a dinner and to negotiate with him on helping the citizens of his province, one of my security team was Staff Sergeant Ed Deza-Chacon, who I became quite friendly with and had dinner and drinks with after we got back from John Muhammad Khan's compound. And just a few weeks later, Staff Sergeant Deza-Chacon was killed by a roadside bomb, he and two others. And this is the kind of hero that we're talking about. 5th Special Forces soldier, tough guy, gave his all for the American cause in Afghanistan. And regardless of what you thought about why we were in Afghanistan and whether or not we should have been there, he was doing his job. And he protected me and many others while he was there. I got to come home and he didn't. And that saddens me to this day. So I also want to dedicate this episode especially to Staff Sergeant Ed Deza-Chacon. And I wish that I could jump on Facebook and send him a message right now, but I can't because he gave all in pursuit of our mission in Afghanistan. Kandahar. How can you talk about Afghanistan without Kandahar province? Kandahar was ground central for the Taliban. It was also the area of prominence for the Karzai family. It's an amazing city. They've got the tomb of Mirwas Khan Hotak there, which is a beautiful, beautiful structure. The Kirka Sharif, the Shrine of the Cloak, which was in somewhat disrepair while I was there, but still very beautiful. The Red Mosque, Chilzina, the 40 Steps of Kandahar, which was the steps up the old citadel, which was destroyed in 1738. Amazing markets in that city. Just a lot of remembrances there. Going to watch bread being made, helping make bread. There's a picture where I'm in a suit, taking bread out of an oven. It was a great Instagram photo, but I doubt anybody ate the bread that I pulled out of that oven. It was Kandahar was the example that we were trying to set, meaning the American coalition, for the changes in Afghanistan. A new road was built from Kabul to Kandahar. A lot of people died building that road because it became a target for the Taliban insurrection. But Kandahar was a lawless place, and it was a place that was hard to develop systems and processes, and to this day, I'm sure that Kandahar under Taliban 2.0 rule now since 2021 is just as haphazard a place as it's always been. Then there was Helmand province. Lashkar Gah was one of the major towns down there. We called it Las Vegas. One of the great remembrances I have there is I wasn't there at the time, actually. I was in Kabul, but my friend Fran was down there, and she called while I was at dinner. And all I can hear is her voice and machine gun fire in the background. And I said, "Where are you?" She said, "I'm in Las Vegas." I said, "What is going on?" She said, "Oh, they're just practicing. The Afghan army is practicing their fighting techniques, and so they're just wasting ammunition." But if she hadn't told me that, I would have thought that she was under attack. It was just surreal to hear all the machine gun fire behind her on that phone call. That's the kind of place Lashkar Gah was. Las Vegas was lawless. Then there was the beautiful area of Bamyan with Bandamir National Park, which was the first national park in Afghanistan. Beautiful turquoise-looking lake there, surrounded by mountains. Fantastic. The Red City there in Bamyan, which some called the City of Screams, where Genghis Khan attacked the city and eventually took the city and sacked most of the city back in the ancient times. Had amazing archaeological sites there. And of course, that's where the famous Buddhas had been, on the hillside where Mullah Omar had them blown up, the ancient and huge Buddha statues. The holes are still there where they were, but the Buddha statues are gone. When we went to Bamyan, we stayed at the Provincial Reconstruction Team compound there, which was overseen by the New Zealand Army, the Kiwis, and it was a peaceful area. Not much happened in Bamyan from a security standpoint, so the Kiwis did a lot of working out. They'd lift weights, play some football, play some cricket, patrol the city. They were having quite a good time in the times I visited in Bamyan. So it was pretty good duty for the New Zealand Army soldiers that were there. Then Herat over in the west, governed by a warlord I talked about earlier named Ismail Khan. It has a beautiful citadel there, one of the best in Afghanistan, actually. It has the great Jami Masjid Mosque, Khwaja Abdullah Ansari Shrine, Jami's tomb. Beautiful city, amazing city. On the occasions that I visited there, we did a lot of advocacy work up there. We did a lot of work with the Afghanistan International Chamber of Commerce there. And it was as cosmopolitan a city as you could find in Afghanistan outside of Kabul. And cosmopolitan, I'm putting in air quotes, but it was probably second in prominence, or third, depending on where you put Kandahar, as far as cities in the country. Then, of course, there was Nangarhar province. Its major city was Jalalabad. Lots of trips there. One trip I remember to Jalalabad, and by the way, the expats called it J-Bad or just plain bad. It was not a pleasant place, but I remember going over there one time in the heat of the summer, and I mean, it was hot. It was in the upper 40s Celsius, which is in Fahrenheit, if you do the math, is extremely hot. And we'd worked out all day in the heat, and before we began the drive back to Kabul, I knew that our guards loved ice cream, and so I said, we're going to get some ice cream. So we rolled into downtown Jalalabad. We found a place serving ice cream. There was a man out on the street, he's scooping the ice cream, and we jump out. These vehicles pull up, all these guards jump out, I jump out. He sees this, thinks it's a suicide bombing waiting to happen, and immediately starts to run. The guards grab him, bring him back. I'll never forget how terrorized that guy was in serving the ice cream. I actually felt bad for him. I apologized to him and made sure that he was well compensated for the ice cream, because he was literally scared to death serving that ice cream. There's a picture that I love and have here in my office of myself and our guards and the rest of our team sitting in that little ice cream shop in Jalalabad on that very, very hot day. And I could go on about Jalalabad, but nothing else I would say would be uplifting or something that I want to really talk about, so I'm going to stop right there. And then Nuristan. Nuristan's an area of Afghanistan that's really interesting, because it used to be called Kafiristan, or land of the infidels, because there were so many different amalgamation of invaders that had come through that area, including Alexander the Great. And for many years, up until the late 19th century, it was not an Islamic area. It was converted or forced into Islam, actually, through a lot of fighting in that area. But one of the most beautiful places in the country, the Kandesh Valley, the Parun Valley, the Wama Valley, this is beautiful, beautiful area. And the furniture they make in Nuristan is like something you can't even believe. Our house in Kabul was filled with this Nuristani furniture. I wish I could have brought it back with me, because it was so brightly colored and beautiful furniture. I have a mirror from there and a few other pieces of wood carvings, hand-painted wood carvings from Nuristan. Very beautiful. The interesting thing is, because of the Greek influence there in ancient times, the people in Nuristan tended to be lighter skinned, and many had blue eyes, because part of their DNA or part of their descendants were Greek. And so it was a very interesting area of the country. I could go on and on, about places and people and events, but I think I've hit the highlights there. I also wanted to talk on this podcast episode about our work that we did in Afghanistan. I've alluded to this a little bit, but I want to delve into it just a little bit. When I first got to Afghanistan in October of 2003, my first stop was the United States Agency for International Development office, which at that time was in the old embassy. I found in the entire USAID team hunkered down in the old embassy, surrounded by sandbags, with the mission director, deputy mission director, and everybody else all in one room, basically. And their question to me was a very short one that day. What can you do to help us? And I talked a little bit about what the Center for International Private Enterprise or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce could do. And the head of the USAID mission there said, we need somebody to rebuild the Afghan International Chamber of Commerce. Can you do it? And I said, what do you mean? They said, look, it got blown up, basically. Staff is gone. We would like you to rebuild it, to rehire the staff, to rebrand it, etc. So that was our first project there, to restart the Afghan National Chamber of Commerce. It was rebranded the Afghan International Chamber of Commerce. And for a while, I was the de facto head of that chamber until we hired the new staff, and it got moving forward under its own steam. It was really a labor of love, and something that to this day is a legacy of the Americans in Afghanistan. It eventually merged with the newly constituted Afghan National Chamber of Commerce, and hopefully even today, with the return of the Taliban, is continuing to do business development and try to generate investment into Afghanistan. But it was an amalgamation of a lot of traders, both Afghan expatriates and local Afghans, who came together in self-governance to try to create business opportunities. It was really an interesting project, and one where we met some amazing people, and it created a legacy for the United States government in Afghanistan. The second project that we were awarded in Afghanistan was to develop the first Afghan Women's Business Association in the country that was governed by the women themselves. And we were able to do that. And it was something that was very controversial. It was something that had a huge amount of resistance, but we were able to get it done. And these women were so proud of the work that they were doing. They were so proud that they had their own office, and that they were able to govern it themselves, and they were able to make decisions themselves. We had an amazing program manager there, Christina, who had been on my team in Romania, who came to Afghanistan to oversee our work with the Afghan Women's Business Association. And it was absolutely amazing, the kinds of things that they did to help the women of Afghanistan. Regrettably, in 2021, when the Taliban retook the country, I'm told that that organization no longer exists. But you can't unring that bell, because the women who were involved in that will never forget that period of their lives, will never forget the time that they were able to govern themselves, to make their own money, to support their families, to live the kind of life that they had to that point in time not been afforded. So you can take away the building, you can take away the mandate, but you're not going to be able to take away the memories from those women. Also, we ran a program for the National Endowment for Democracy called Tashabaz, where we bought books and trained teachers in hundreds of schools across Afghanistan to teach entrepreneurship. And young girls and boys were learning about entrepreneurship. They were learning about saving money. They were learning about creating products. They were learning about selling products. Each of these little schools had things that the students were making and selling, and they were taking that money and investing it in other things that they could sell. They were learning about entrepreneurship, and they were going home and teaching their parents this as well. This is one of the things that virtually every warlord in the country could agree was a good thing. And they allowed us to go in schools all over the country and provide the Tashabaz program. Tashabaz means entrepreneurship. That's the closest word the Afghans have to entrepreneurship. And to implement it in these schools. Again, that program may not exist today because the Taliban have come back and girls are once again prohibited from going to school. But I can tell you that what they learned during that time can't be unlearned. And I'm very proud of that. We also did the Afghan University Leadership Program, where for the first time we brought Afghan men and women together in one room on equal footing to learn leadership and to plan projects, etc. Different ethnicities. We had Pashtuns, we had Tajiks, we had Uzbeks, We had men, we had women, we had rural, we had urban. It was an amazing program, and I remember the day that they graduated from that program, how proud they were of what they had accomplished. You know, the work that those of us in international development have done, it doesn't always stick because some governments change, approaches change, circumstances change, just like in Afghanistan. And so sometimes your best laid plans don't work out, but I can tell you I'm proud of the work that we did there, and I'm proud of the work the United States did there and its coalition partners. We helped people. And even to this day, whatever happens from here on out, I can say that I did my best, my team did its best, and that we worked with some amazing people in Afghanistan that I wish nothing but the best for the rest of their lives. I'm going to stop right there on this episode of Some Stops Along the Way. I could say so much more about Afghanistan, but a lot of it is not something that I probably would want to share on a podcast, but quite frankly, the absurdity of it, you probably wouldn't believe anyway. So if you want to know a little bit more, read it in Some Stops Along the Way. Otherwise, join me next time. We're going to dive into some more fascinating countries and meet some interesting people, learn about culture, history, and political context. See you next week on Some Stops Along the Way.